Hello again. So I'm going to be talking about cyber resilience of the UK. We're going to be talking about the challenges we face as a whole country, as opposed to thinking about just what happens in the government. So the big thinking about this sort of set out in the UK National Cyber Strategy, which the government published in 2022. That strategy described it as a whole of society approach. So the idea is that to be resilient as a whole country, it needs to kind of apply to everybody. Okay? So it's not just about more resilient government. It's also about the resilience of our critical national infrastructure. So parts of the private sector, which are really, really important, so energy networks, our telecoms networks, etc., as well as our public services. Also more broadly, businesses and organisations. Bit further away from government. How cyber resilient are they? And again, as David referenced in recent weeks, seeing attacks on Marks and Spencer's, JLR, it really, really brings it into focus, doesn't it? We're sort of reading headlines now about government possibly even having to bail out JLR, private sector manufacturer, just because of the scale of the attack and the impact there on the UK economy. And then, of course, we're thinking about resilience in terms of impact on us as citizens. Much, much more broadly now. And, of course, here, all of the issues which we see more and more around fraud, for example, around scams affecting more and more people. So, this whole of society approach, which government set out 2022, it was really about taking action at all of these different levels. And, the kind of things that were put in place were lots of guidance, the central services. So NCSC has offered more technical services which can be used by businesses and charities, for example, trying to drive the uptake of standards like Cyber Essentials, and then the particular focus on critical national infrastructure and government itself. So compliance has also been part of the journey, and it's where government has actually used the law regulatory frameworks to drive kind of really specific action here. So not just kind of awareness, not just about guidance and being helpful, but actually putting in place hard duties. So back in, I think, 2017, 2018, NIS regulations came in. That was brought over from EU legislation, which set out cybersecurity duties for critical national infrastructure. So operators of essential services, so energy, telecoms, etc., water, that sort of thing. So GDPR was the next really important thing, Data Protection Act. Then there came some really critical, very specific duties for telecoms operators in 2021 and 2022. Also for product security. So I think George just mentioned earlier that there was a piece of legislation there which product security manufacturers to do things like not setting the default password to be 0000, whatever. Cyber assessment framework was brought in, cyber assurance, so that became mandatory for government and critical national infrastructure. So something that happened this year, as I was particularly pleased to see, was the Cyber Governance Code of Practice. And this is a voluntary code. And so this is quite a departure from government, because this actually applies for directors of any company. It is voluntary, it's not statutory. But, the Code of Practice can be used by directors, board members in any sector. So this steps right out of that that kind of focus that we've seen before on critical national infrastructure and government, much broader. And possibly later this year, we're hoping to see another piece of legislation, and this will actually expand the scope of those much more pressing duties set out in NIS. So, for example, to bring new sectors into the scope of those regulations, so managed service providers, for example. And what this bill also does is it allows government to add new sectors to the scope of NIS, which is really quite something, actually. So this means that new sectors might suddenly find themselves, from one day to the next, a regulated sector, actually having specific regulations around cybersecurity. So that's quite a different place to be. So, what we're seeing is the kind of level of control that government is able to exert over all of the organisations in the UK. It's starting to expand, the area, the locus of control. So this is all good stuff. Now, here's the challenge, though. Hands up if you were alive in 1976. Okay, right. So about half of us are really bloody old and the rest of you are all right. Okay, so, I remember this poster, so classic poster, and I think that the message of this picture was supposed to kind of help us to be aware of just how parochial most of us are and kind of thinking about the world and its issues. So here, you know, the classic New Yorker standing in 9th Avenue has a really, really detailed understanding of the kind of street they live in. And, you know, the next street, yep, still aware of it, maybe in less detail. And then suddenly, you know, other parts of the country actually really don't know very much about that. And far, far, far away, there are these absolutely gigantic countries which, you know, barely register. So, you know, all of us have this kind of, you know, there's a proximity effect, isn't there? We tend to focus on what's closest to us, and that which is further away, that's less known to us, we tend to kind of just know less about it, focus less about it, and take it, perhaps pay less attention generally. Now, this is a challenge because, you know, government is made up of big organisations, and that is not what the rest of the UK looks like. Here's something. So here's some data which DCIT published from the Cyber Breaches Survey, just kind of designed to show that the situation for medium to large organisations was not that brilliant, quite frankly. So 74% of large organisations reported cyber breaches. Despite that, it's obviously very common, despite that, only 2/3 of large organisations have a strategy in place. Less than half review the cyber risks from their immediate supplier. We were talking about that just now, don't we? Just over half of medium organisations have an incident response plan. That's kind of worrying. Only 23, so less than a quarter of large organisations assess the risks in their wider supply chain, very concerning, and just over a third of medium businesses have not undertaken any cybersecurity risk assessments in the last year. Okay, so these are businesses, so they're not part of government itself. You know, these are businesses in the wider economy. Government is kind of surveying out and saying outside of government, the picture is a bit ropey. It doesn't look that great. But here's the thing, these figures here, these cover large organisations and medium organisations. And here is the challenge. What we tend to think of, particularly those of us who work in and around government, is we tend to think about an organisation as being a big organisation with, you know, thousands, maybe even hundreds of thousands of employees. And in fact, in the UK, there's only 8,000 of them. They're really not that many. The average organisation is really, really small. And there are 1.4 million of those with, so employees of kind of 10 and under. So it's really... So that proximity effect, you know, where we tend to kind of think about the needs and preferences and qualities and characteristics of organisations. And if we're always thinking about that in terms of big organisations, we're going to be pretty misled. We need to think now to start thinking about the cyber resilience of the average organisation in the UK, which is small and does not have very much capability. And by the way, these smaller organisations, you know, they're going to be your suppliers, your service users, your partners, your customers. That's what you've got to be thinking about, the 1.4 million of them. And here's the trouble. I hate to make such a bold statement, but going on the evidence of who has Cyber Essentials or Cyber Essentials Plus, which has got to be seen as a kind of minimum standard, only 2% of organisations have Cyber Essentials. So it's 98% of organisations do not have that as a minimum standard, which I would say is quite good evidence that most organisations don't care enough about cybersecurity. And again, these guys could be your suppliers, your service users, your partners, your customers. So, you know, I think we in this room will have been highly focused on that 2%, won't we? So we either work in those organisations, those big, highly capable organisations. We work with them, you know, they're our customers, they're our partners, etc. And that 2% of highly capable organisations, well, or rather, I mean, they're the ones who have the kind of baseline of cybersecurity. You know, they're a minority. So this is the challenge we need to consider when we think about the UK's cyber resilience. Most organisations don't have very much capability. So most organisations do not have a CISO. In fact, most don't even have an IT department. Okay. If you look at their boards and their senior leaders, 90% of their attention is going to be focused on either growing income or delivering the mission or both. And for them, actually compliance, most of that legislation and stuff doesn't apply to them. All of that legislation and that regulation, it applies to, very small number of big complex organisations. So for these guys, compliance usually means GDPR. And the problem with GDPR is it's very focused on protecting data. It doesn't protect service integrity. It encourages organisations to think about data, but not their ability to kind of keep running, So with an attack like Marks and Spencer's, for example, any regulatory fines that come into it will be because customer data was breached. With JLR, for example. But, the fact that JLR's production lines were taken down and some of their suppliers will be put out of business, that won't figure at all in any kind of regulatory fines. So GDPR is not enough, and arguably it kind of it focuses minds in the private sector in kind of the wrong place. So this is the environment, we face today. So things really need to change. So what needs to happen next? We definitely do need to see further extension of the NIS regime, that much more demanding regulatory requirements to more at-risk sectors. Sectors I would particularly like that extended to is, the managed service providers and tech sector generally. So government does plan to extend it to managed service providers. So that's been a stated intention. It's especially important because MSPs support small to medium organisations. So those organisations without their own IT department and bigger organisations as well will use MSPs, very, very dependent. So if the MSPs themselves are not kind of putting in place basic protection, then that's a real problem. So those guys need to raise their game. And really, I find interesting about this is often how few questions get asked, certainly by smaller organisations of their tech suppliers. Smaller organisations outside the public sector generally have much, much lower standards, lower quality standards in procurement. Procurement is much more informal. There are limited ability to kind of really carry out much assurance. I think it's fair to say that there are many tech companies which also don't have particularly good standards of cybersecurity and who aren't necessarily having to answer very much for it. I think tech sector is so critical. Tech sector can endanger its customers, as we've seen from the discussions around software supply chain, etc. So I would like to see more demands there put on the private sector. I think another thing that can happen, we are seeing this happening in some areas, is where large organisations take much more responsibility for their small partners' cyber resilience. So, for example, there's a really great initiative which government has sponsored, which is where the largest retail banks are kind of rolling out or supporting their suppliers to achieve cyber essentials. So I think this is a really fantastic initiative because, the banks know it's in their interest, their suppliers, they kind of endanger them. But also, the big banks, for those small suppliers, the big bank is a really, really influential player. If you're a small organisation and you're serving Barclays, NatWest, Lloyds, you're going to listen to what they tell you. And if they want you to do cyber essentials as a condition of doing business, you're probably going to do it. So this stuff works, and I'd like to see more of that. I think it's past time that we saw more public procurement reform. It's still amazing to me that basic cyber essentials accreditation isn't mandatory across all public procurement. I think it's probably a matter of time. Certainly kind of higher risk contracts, we already see that. So I think these things are already happening. I think it's a really interesting question, at least, to ask whether some sectors might not be actually mandated to take cyber insurance. I think after what we saw this week with JLR, you probably read the headlines which said that JLR was actually negotiating, was talking about cyber insurance, but it didn't have it in place. And if the government is then having to step in and kind of bail out and to take the taxpayer having to take some of the kind of risk, stands to reason. There are other areas where there is it's mandatory for private companies to have insurance. Employment, for example, if you employ people by law, you have to have insurance. They're unreasonable to me, so we could see that. So yeah, just a kind of final thought on what my organisation does. So we set up CXB specifically to help those organisations which I've described today, which tend to be smaller, which tend to be much less resourced, less mature, less able to deal with this kind of stuff, because we kind of passionately believe that, you know, responsibility, ultimately the buck stops with the people at the top. If those guys have been sort of choosing not to look too closely at this, hopefully all the evidence is all around them now that they need to do that, but they do need support. So we're helping to push out the Cyber Governance Code of Practice to them, and we're hoping also to pilot a kind of formal board education offer for them next year. So more to come on that. That's it from me.
Thank you. Thank you, Jessica. Really interesting presentation. On the board training that you just talked about, is that only for the private sector and charities or third sector? Is it not for public sector organisations?
Yeah, we can do it for public sector organisations too. Yeah, so actually we run a kind of free, it's a sort of pro bono peer network for non-exec directors, and there are actually quite a lot of directors of public boards in the network. Yeah.
We're looking for some, that's why.
Yeah, brilliant. Well, yeah, come
Training,
and chat. Yeah, come and chat.
Good. Any others? One up the front, just over here, just around here. Yeah, thank you. Great, thank you very much.
We talked on the panel this morning about AI and the impact that's going to have on the whole identity ecosystem. My view is it's probably going to have an equal, if not bigger, impact on the cyber resilience ecosystem as well. And how prepared do you think we are actually to meet the threat that we're going to be facing in the next couple of years?
Yeah, not at all. The way I see this is that digital technologies have already created a more volatile world. It's not just that things move more quickly, it's things change more quickly and they interact with each other in more unpredictable ways, don't they? So we bring AI into the mix, which is a probabilistic technology rather than a deterministic one. It's, based on what we used to call fuzzy logic, and, by design, it's liable to lead to some quite unpredictable outcomes, isn't it? So you have that playing out across thousands and thousands of organisations, across supply chains. And yeah, it leads us to some quite interesting places, doesn't it? I think because of that, a fundamental skill set which organisations, leadership and boards are going to have is this mentality around anticipating and dealing with uncertainty and ambiguity, and what kind of frameworks do you put in place to do that in a systematic way? Otherwise you're always just going to be reacting, aren't you, every single day in crisis mode. Yeah, so we need to get in front of that.
Thank you. Anyone else? No, I don't think so. There's just a comment here. This is probably more related to what we said previously, but there's a comment that came in on Slido. If you could rank the 3 risks you mentioned, what is the order? Skills and culture ranks number 1 in terms of awareness and the understanding of responsibility. So just a thought there.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, good.
Yeah.
Fine. Jessica, thank you very much.
Yeah.
That's great. Thank you.